The Prefect patrol log for the 5th floor, submitted late on a Tuesday evening in late October, contained an irregularity. It was not the first irregularity of the term. The log, a thick-bound ledger maintained by the head boy and head girl, and stored on the 3rd shelf of the Prefect's bathroom anteroom, had already accumulated several minor notations since September. A door found unlocked in the charms corridor, a flickering torch bracket near the Transfiguration classroom that maintenance had been slow to address, a 3rd-year court in possession of a fanged frisbee during what should have been supervised study time. Each entry had been noted, reviewed, initialed, and resolved without incident. This entry was different. The handwriting belonged to Anthony Goldstein, a 6th-year Ravenclaw prefect who had been assigned the Tuesday late patrol since the start of term. His entries were generally reliable, legible, timed, and specific. He noted which students he had directed back to their dormitories, which doors he had tested for proper latching, and on one occasion, the precise location of a stray garden gnome that had somehow migrated into the castle through an improperly sealed side passage near the greenhouses. That evening's entry read as follows: 5th floor, East Corridor, grid reference, E7 through E9, standard patrol complete. No irregularities. Proceeded to junction at E10. Luna Lovegood, Ravenclaw, 5th year, discovered standing at unmarked corridor entrance. Approximate position, E11. Corridor not listed on current patrol map. Student appeared unharmed. Directed to return to Ravenclaw Tower. Student compliant. Corridor entrance noted for follow-up. Note: corridor entrance not present on patrol map issued at start of term. Unclear if omission or structural feature. Flagging for review. Anthony had signed his name beneath it, added the time of completion, and clipped a small hand-drawn diagram to the entry, indicating the corridor's position relative to the main east wing junction. The diagram was careful and to scale, insofar as he could estimate in the dark with no measuring tools available. He had noted the wall material on either side of the entrance, the approximate width of the opening, and the fact that no torch bracket was present within the visible stretch of the corridor itself, making detailed inspection without additional light impractical. The log had been reviewed the following morning by Hannah Abbott, who was serving as prefect coordinator for the week in the absence of the head girl, who had a scheduling conflict with an early arithmancy tutorial. Hannah had initialed Anthony's entry, flagged it in the margin with a small red asterisk, and sent a written query to Argus Filch's office before breakfast was finished. Filch received the query with the Morning Post. He read it twice, standing at his desk in the caretaking office on the ground floor. The office was functional in the way that most caretaking spaces are. Tools on hooks, records in stacked folders, a single window that admitted light but had not been cleaned since late August. Mrs. Norris was seated on the corner of the desk, observing nothing in particular. Filch was familiar with the 5th floor east wing. He had patrolled it himself on many occasions and had, over the course of his tenure at Hogwarts, logged several dozen maintenance queries originating from that section of the castle. Loose flagstones, a portrait with a damaged frame, a suit of armor with a dislodged gauntlet that rattled when students passed. He had dealt with all of these in his own time and to his own satisfaction. He did not recognize the grid reference E11. This was not immediately alarming. Grid references on the patrol maps were updated only at the start of each academic year, and the maps themselves were based on a survey of the castle conducted in 1973, cross-referenced with an earlier survey from 1951. Hogwarts was not a static structure. Staircases moved, rooms occasionally rearranged their internal arrangements. There was a broom cupboard on the 4th floor that had inexplicably increased in floor area by approximately 6 square feet sometime during the summer of 1987, and no satisfactory explanation had ever been formally recorded, though Filch had noted it in the maintenance ledger, and it had been signed off by the then deputy headmistress with a notation reading castle variance, acceptable. Still, a corridor that was not on the map required attention. He retrieved the current patrol map from the second drawer of the filing cabinet, a large folded parchment that was itself a simplified version of the full castle survey, and spread it across his desk, displacing a tin of polish and a repair invoice for the main staircase balustrade that had not yet been addressed. Grid reference E11 on the patrol map was a wall. Filch traced the corridor line from E7 through E10 with his finger. The main east wing ran straight and uninterrupted along that stretch. At E10, the map indicated a junction, the short passage connecting to the staircase that led down to the 4th floor. Beyond E10, the wall continued. There was no entrance. There was no corridor. He noted this in his maintenance log under structural anomaly. Unverified, wrote a brief summary of the Prefect's report and marked the entry pending site inspection. Then he pulled on his outer robe, collected his lantern from the hook beside the door, and told Mrs. Norris he would be on the 5th floor if she needed him. The 5th floor east wing that morning was not deserted, but it was quieter than it would be later in the day. A few students moved through it on their way to morning classes, most of them carrying bags and looking at schedules rather than at the walls. A pair of 4th-year Hufflepuffs nodded at Filch as he passed. He did not nod back. He walked the corridor from the eastern staircase, moving at his standard inspection pace, unhurried, methodical. He checked the torch brackets as he went, not because they were the subject of the query, but because checking torch brackets was part of his routine on any 5th floor walkthrough. 3 of them were functioning correctly. One, near E8, had a flicker that suggested the enchantment was beginning to wear. He noted it. At the junction at E10, he stopped. The wall to his right was continuous stone, grey, closely fitted, with a horizontal line of darker rock running through it at waist height that indicated a repair carried out at some point in the castle's long history. The surface was unbroken. There was no entrance. There was no corridor. Filch examined the wall in sections, beginning at the junction and moving east. He pressed his palm flat against the stone in 3 places, which was not a spell. Filch had no magic, but a physical test he had developed over decades of working in the castle. Stone that concealed something often felt different to the touch, colder in some cases, vibrating faintly in others, or simply wrong in a way that was difficult to articulate, but that he had learned to recognize. This stretch of wall was ordinary, cool, solid, and consistent. There was no vibration, no irregularity, no sense that anything lay beyond it. He stood at the precise coordinates Anthony Goldstein had indicated and looked at the wall for a long moment. Then he recorded in his notebook, "Site inspection conducted. No entrance present at indicated location. Wall surface intact. No structural irregularity detected. Query unresolved. He would need to flag it for the deputy headmistress. Professor McGonagall received Filch's written note during the mid-morning break between her second and third period transfiguration classes. She read it, standing at her desk, still holding a piece of chalk, and reread it once before setting it beside her register. The Hogwarts maintenance process had a defined route for flagged structural concerns. Reports from prefects moved through the prefect log to the caretaking office. Reports from the caretaking office moved to the deputy headmistress, who assessed them and either resolved them directly or escalated to the headmaster, depending on severity. The system had been operating in approximately this form since at least the mid-1800s, which was as far back as the institutional records currently accessible in the administrative archive went. Structural anomalies were not common, but they were not unprecedented. McGonagall had dealt with 7 in her years as deputy headmistress, not counting routine staircase movements, which were managed by Charm's maintenance staff under a separate protocol. Of the 7 structural anomalies, 5 had been resolved by identifying the relevant enchantment category and submitting the finding to the castle's Charms infrastructure team. 1 had been closed as a natural castle variance, and 1 remained technically open in the archive, though it had not produced any further incidents since 1987. What distinguished this query from the routine Charms maintenance reports was the prefect's notation. The corridor had been present the previous evening. It had not been present that morning. That was the part that required attention. She wrote a brief response to Filch's note. Acknowledged, under review. Continue standard monitoring, and made a separate note in her own administrative ledger to consult the castle's formal mapping records. If the corridor existed as a genuine structural feature, however intermittent, it would need to be properly classified. She also noted that the student found at the entrance, Luna Lovegood, 5th year, Ravenclaw, would need to be interviewed as part of the review, not urgently, but formally and on the record. Luna Lovegood was in herbology when the note reached her, delivered by a small grey owl that descended into Greenhouse 3 with a composure that the plants, at least, did not share. Professor Sprout noted the delivery without comment. Luna read the note, folded it precisely, and placed it in the front pocket of her bag. The note was from Professor McGonagall. It informed her that as part of a routine follow-up to the Prefect Patrol report, her account of the event would be requested at a time to be confirmed, likely during a free period within the next 2 days. It was not a summons, the note clarified. It was a standard procedural step. Luna had expected something of this kind. She had been found in a corridor well past permitted hours, and she had given Anthony Goldstein a brief account of what she had seen. Not in full detail, because he had not asked for full detail, and she had not volunteered more than was relevant to his purposes. He had wanted to know if she was all right and what she was doing there. She had told him she was exploring and that the corridor had been there when she arrived. She had not told him what the corridor had felt like when she stepped inside it. She had not told him about the sounds. Those were things she was still organizing in her own mind, and until she had organized them sufficiently, she did not see any purpose in introducing them into an official record. She would tell Professor McGonagall what she knew, but she would need to think carefully about how to describe something that did not, as far as she could tell, have a standard category in the school's existing framework. The corridor had been quiet and warm. The sounds had not been frightening. They had been, if anything, familiar in character. The kind of familiarity that came not from recognition of specific voices, but from recognition of tone. Arguments conducted in low voices. A burst of laughter from somewhere further in. A question repeated by someone who had not yet received an answer, and an answer given too quietly to make out. It had not felt like a haunting. The ghosts of Hogwarts had a distinct quality, a visibility, a weight to their presence. This had been different, less like something remaining, and more like something recorded. She had stood in the entrance for several minutes before the Prefect's footsteps had become audible behind her. She had not gone further in. She had not, in the end, needed to. She noted the contents of McGonagall's letter, tucked it away, and returned her attention to the mandrake she was repotting. Greenhouse 3 was warm and smelled of loam and something faintly sulphurous. Outside, the grounds were grey under an October sky. She would speak to Harry, she decided, before she spoke to McGonagall. Not because she required his involvement in the procedural matter, but because the corridor had, in her assessment, done something worth reporting accurately. An accuracy, in this case, would require a second point of reference. The Prefect log, by the end of the day, had been updated with 2 additional initialed entries. One from Hannah Abbott, confirming that Filch's query had been received and forwarded, and one from the head boy noting that the Tuesday patrol route for the 5th floor would be temporarily amended to include a written observation of the E10 to E11 corridor wall at the beginning and end of each patrol until further notice. It was a small procedural amendment, the kind made dozens of times each term in response to minor operational uncertainties. It would not affect the rest of the school's schedule. Students would continue arriving for breakfast at the usual hour. Classes would run to their timetabled end times. The staircases would move on their usual rotations. Hogwarts, as it always did, continued. The administrative archive at Hogwarts was not a room that most students knew existed. It was located on the 2nd floor, behind a door that presented itself to anyone who had not been formally directed to it as an unremarkable section of panelled wall between a portrait of a 16th century herbologist and a stone alcove that housed a suit of armour missing its left pauldron. The door had no handle. It opened in response to the spoken name of whoever currently held the position of Deputy Headmistress, a security measure that had been in place since at least the tenure of Deputy Headmistress Eustacia Vane in the 1840s, according to the small brass plate fixed to the inside of the doorframe, which nobody read because nobody who had not already been told about the archive would have any reason to look at the inside of a doorframe in an unremarkable section of wall. Professor McGonagall arrived at the archive that afternoon, having completed her last class of the day, a third-year session covering the fundamental principles of switching spells, and eaten a brief and functional lunch at the staff table between reviewing 2 sets of 4th-year essays and responding to a query from Professor Flitwick about the scheduling of a charms assessment. She was carrying her administrative ledger, a fresh length of parchment, and a self-inking quill. The archive was long and narrow, lit by a row of wall-mounted lanterns that burned steadily at a uniform height. The shelves ran the full length of both walls, floor to ceiling, and were organized by category and decade. Records here were kept in the original. No copies were made. And the preservation charms on the parchment were refreshed every 5 years by a specialist from the Ministry's Department of Magical Records and Registry, who visited in June during the last week of term when the students were occupied with examinations and the disruption could be minimized. The cartographic section occupied the far third of the archive's right-hand wall. It was distinguishable from the general administrative records by the width of the rolled tubes stored in the upper sections. The full castle surveys required larger storage formats than standard ledger parchment, and by the small printed card fixed to the shelf edge that read, in Headmistress Dippet's handwriting from the early 50s, Castle Surveys and Structural Documentation, authorized access only. McGonagall knew the archive's organization well. She had been consulting it in her capacity as deputy headmistress for over 15 years, and before that had accessed it on 3 occasions during her first decade of teaching, twice in connection with Transfiguration classroom maintenance concerns, and once to verify the historical usage of a particular section of the 6th floor for a report requested by the Board of Governors. She located the cartographic section without difficulty, set her ledger on the narrow standing desk positioned midway along the archive for exactly this purpose, and began with the most recent full survey. The 1973 survey was the current official document. It had been commissioned by Headmaster Dumbledore, following a period of what the accompanying administrative note described as irregular structural activity, a phrase that was not further elaborated upon, and conducted over the course of a single summer by a team of 3 specialist cartographers from the Department of Magical Buildings and Infrastructure. The survey was comprehensive. It documented every room, corridor, passage, staircase, and structural void in the castle at the time of survey, cross-referenced with a set of standard grid references established for that purpose. The grid references were the same system now used in the Prefect patrol maps. McGonagall unrolled the 5th floor section and anchored the corners with the small brass weights kept in the standing desk drawer for exactly this purpose. The paper was large and detailed, marked in precise lines with room dimensions, noted in the margins and annotations in 2 different hands, one from the original survey team, one added subsequently in a different ink color, which she recognized as Dumbledore's. She located the east wing. The corridor ran clearly from E7 through the junction and E10. Beyond E10, the wall was marked as solid, a double line indicating load-bearing stone, with a notation in the margin reading exterior face, undisturbed. There was no corridor at E11. There was no entrance in the wall. The survey confirmed what the patrol map showed. Unbroken stone. She noted this and moved to the previous survey. The 1951 survey had been conducted under Headmistress Dippet, who had preceded Dumbledore in the role. It was older and slightly less precise. The grid references in use at that time used a different numbering scheme, which required a conversion chart kept in a folder at the front of the cartographic section, but it was thorough. The 1951 survey was the document that the 1973 survey had used as its primary reference, updating and correcting where necessary. McGonagall converted the relevant grid references and located the 5th floor east wing on the older document. The corridor ran from the equivalent of E7 through the junction. At the point corresponding to E10, there was the same junction marking, and beyond it, McGonagall leaned forward slightly. There was an annotation. It was small, written in a precise hand that she did not immediately recognize. In ink that had faded to a grey-brown with age, it read, Passage, Eastern Continuation, Designation, Unclassified, Access, Variable, Refer to Structural Notes, Volume 14. She straightened and looked at the annotation for a moment. Then she wrote it down in full in her ledger, noted the survey date and page reference, and went to locate Volume 14 of the Structural Notes. The Structural Notes were a series of bound volumes, numbered sequentially, that recorded observations made by caretaking and maintenance staff over the course of the castle's documented history. They were not a survey. They were accumulated observations written in the field by individuals whose job it was to notice when something in the castle changed. They were consequently irregular in format, inconsistent in handwriting, and varying enormously in the level of detail provided. Some entries ran to several pages. Others were a single line. Volume 14 covered the period from the early 30s through the late 50s. McGonagall found the reference. It was written in the same precise hand as the annotation on the 1951 survey, which suggested the same individual had authored both. The entry was dated to the spring of 1948. Regarding the unclassified passage, 5th floor east, noted in the survey reference, the passage has been observed on 7 occasions since initial documentation in 1933. Observations occur at irregular intervals and do not correspond to any consistent schedule or seasonal pattern. The passage presents as an open corridor entrance in the east wall at the end of the main 5th floor east corridor. When present, it extends for an estimated 30 feet before the interior becomes too dark for further observation without specialist illumination. Sounds have been reported by 3 separate maintenance staff members who have approached the entrance, described variously as voices, laughter, and indistinct conversation. No source for these sounds has been identified. The passage does not appear on the 1933 survey, which predates initial documentation. Current classification. Structural anomaly. Origin unknown. Recommended action. Monitor and record. No remediation indicated at this time. The entry was signed with initials only. E.M.F. McGonagall wrote out the full entry in her ledger, word for word. She noted the initials and made a marginal notation to check the staff records for that period against those initials. She noted the date of first documentation, 1933, and the phrase does not appear on the 1933 survey. She noted the count of 7 observed appearances between 1933 and 1948. Then she checked whether there were subsequent entries in the structural notes referencing the same passage. There were 2. The first was in the following volume, dated to the early 60s, in a different hand entirely, less precise, more hurried, as though written quickly. It read, 5th floor east passage observed again, first time in several years to my knowledge. Reported by Prefect on night patrol. No students entered. Entrance closed by morning, noted for record. The second was in a later volume, dated to the late 70s, in a hand McGonagall recognized immediately as that of her predecessor in the deputy headmistress role. It read, "Recurring structural anomaly, 5th floor east. Student report received. 1 Ravenclaw, 6th year, name withheld, observed the passage entrance during late patrol. Student reported hearing voices. No entry made. Entrance not present at morning inspection. Flag to headmaster. Decision. Monitor. No intervention. Classification unchanged." She sat with these entries for several minutes. 1933, 1948, the early 50s, implied, the early 60s, the late 70s, and now, October, 1996. The appearances were irregular, as the 1948 entry had noted. They did not occur on any discernible schedule, but they recurred consistently enough to have been documented across at least 4 separate caretaking tenures and 2 deputy headmistresses, none of whom had classified the matter as resolved. She also noted what the later entry said about the headmaster's response. Monitor. No intervention. She would need to speak to Dumbledore. But first, she would complete the archival review. She spent a further stretch of the afternoon in the archive, checking the general administrative records for any reference to the passage outside the structural notes. She found 3. The first was a brief entry in the school's incident log from the late 30s, in which a student, identified only as female, 5th year, had been found in the east corridor by a prefect during a night patrol, standing outside what she described as an opening in the wall. The incident had been recorded, the student had been returned to her dormitory, and the entry had been closed with a notation reading "No further action required." The second was a note in the staff meeting minutes from the early 60s, under the heading Miscellaneous, in which the caretaker had raised the passage as an item for discussion. The minutes recorded that the matter had been deferred to the deputy headmistress for review and did not appear in the minutes again. The third was a single line in a letter from a former headmaster to the Board of Governors, dated to the turn of the century, a document that had been filed in the archive as part of a broader correspondence set, in which the headmaster mentioned, in passing, that the castle contained several architectural features of uncertain origin that have been present since before current record-keeping and are best understood as institutional rather than problematic. The passage was not named directly, but the phrasing was sufficiently general to encompass it. McGonagall reread that final phrase, institutional rather than problematic. She made a note of it. She left the archive as the evening was settling into the castle, students returning from the grounds, the smell of dinner beginning to reach the upper floors from the kitchens below, the distant sound of the main staircase completing one of its regular repositioning movements. She returned to her office, sat at her desk, and reviewed her notes in sequence. What the archive established was this: the passage had been present in the castle for at least 63 years based on first documentation, and possibly longer. It had appeared on at least 6 recorded occasions, more if the undocumented intervals between the volume entries were accounted for. Each recorded appearance had been brief, gone by morning inspection. Each appearance had been witnessed by students or staff during late evening hours. In every recorded case, the response had been the same: observation, documentation, no intervention. The passage was not a new development. It was not a structural error or a maintenance oversight. It was a feature of the castle that had been acknowledged and deliberately left unresolved because the consistent assessment of the staff who had dealt with it was that it did not require resolution. What it required, it seemed, was classification. The 1948 entry had noted it as structural anomaly, origin unknown. That classification had not been updated in over 40 years. McGonagall wrote at the top of a fresh sheet of parchment, 5th floor East Passage. Preliminary Review Notes, October 1996. Beneath it, she wrote a list of what the archive confirmed, what remained unverified, and what steps the review process required next. The list of unverified items was longer than the confirmed items. That was not unusual at this stage of a review. What mattered was that there was now a framework in place for addressing them methodically. She wrote 2 actions at the bottom of the page. The first, interview Luna Lovegood, formal record of student account. The second, consult full cartographic survey for any pre-1933 documentation. Check Founders Era structural records if available. She set down her quill, capped the ink, and picked up the note she had been composing earlier in the day to the head girl about the Prefect scheduling matter that still required resolution. The archive work had taken longer than planned, which meant the Prefect scheduling matter would need to be addressed that evening rather than the following morning. The castle bell sounded the half hour. McGonagall returned to her administrative correspondence. In the Prefect log, the Tuesday patrol report for the 5th floor had been updated again. Anthony Goldstein had completed his observation entry for the E10 to E11 wall section at the start of the evening patrol. East wall, E10 to E11. No entrance, present. Wall intact. Observation noted. The entry was signed and filed. The log moved on to the next item. Professor McGonagall scheduled the interview for Thursday afternoon, during Luna Lovegood's free period between care of magical creatures and her self-directed study block. The notification was delivered by internal post on Wednesday morning. A folded square of parchment, sealed with the deputy headmistress's standard administrative seal, which was distinct from her personal seal, in that it bore the Hogwarts crest rather than her family insignia. Luna received it at breakfast, read it, and placed it in her bag beside her copy of the Quibbler and a small notebook she used for observations that did not yet have a category. She was not concerned about the interview. She had been interviewed by members of staff on previous occasions, once in second year regarding a missing set of charms textbooks that had eventually been located in a disused classroom on the 4th floor, and once in 4th year when Professor Flitwick had asked her to provide an account of a lesson during which a minor enchantment had behaved unexpectedly. In both cases, the process had been straightforward. She had described what she had observed, the staff member had written it down, and the matter had been filed. This would be the same process. What she had observed was simply less straightforward than a missing textbook. She spent Wednesday evening in the Ravenclaw common room, organizing her account, not writing it out. She did not think written preparation was necessary, but ordering it in her mind, which was the method she found most reliable for ensuring that what she said was accurate and complete. She sat in the window seat with her notebook open on her knee, the scratching of other students' quills providing background noise, and reviewed what she remembered in the sequence it had occurred. The time she had left the dormitory, the route she had taken, the precise point at which she had noticed the entrance, what she had seen, what she had heard, how long she had stood there, what had prompted her to stop rather than enter further, the prefect's arrival. By the time the common room began to empty for curfew, she had the account in order. McGonagall's office that afternoon was arranged, as it always was, for functional use rather than comfort. 2 chairs faced the desk, one behind it, one in front. A third chair was positioned slightly to the side for occasions when a second staff member was present, which today it was not. The desk surface held her administrative ledger, open to a fresh page, her quill and ink, and the preliminary review notes she had compiled after the archive visit. Luna arrived 2 minutes early. She was carrying her bag and had, apparently, come directly from the grounds. There was a faint trace of damp on the hem of her robes and a small piece of dried grass attached to the side of her left boot. "Sit down, Miss Lovegood," McGonagall said. Luna sat. She placed her bag on the floor beside the chair, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at McGonagall with the steady, unhurried attention that McGonagall had come to recognize as characteristic of her. "This is a routine procedural interview," McGonagall said, "conducted as part of the review of the incident reported in the Prefect patrol log on Tuesday evening. I will be recording your account in the administrative log. You are not in any difficulty. I want your account to be as accurate and complete as possible. Do you understand?" "Yes," Luna said. "Good. Begin from the point at which you left Ravenclaw Tower on Tuesday evening." Luna's account was given in a single, uninterrupted sequence, which McGonagall appreciated. Some students, when asked to provide formal accounts, required prompting at intervals to return to the relevant matter after drifting toward tangential observations. Luna did not drift. She was precise about times where she knew them, and appropriately imprecise where she did not, flagging the difference clearly. She had left Ravenclaw Tower some time after the castle had grown quiet. She had not been able to sleep and had decided to walk, which she did on occasion. She was aware that this was outside permitted hours and noted it without apparent concern, which McGonagall recorded without comment. She had taken her usual late evening route, along the 7th floor corridor, down the main staircase to the 5th floor, east toward the junction at E10. She had walked this route before. It was quiet at that hour, and the torches in the east corridor burned at a lower level after the evening bell, which she preferred to the brighter light of the main corridors. At the junction, she had noticed the entrance. "Describe it," McGonagall said. "It was an opening in the wall," Luna said. "The same width as a standard door frame, approximately. There was no door. The wall on either side was the same stone as the rest of the corridor. The opening was simply there, where previously, on the occasions I had walked that route before, there had been no opening. How many times have you walked that route previously?" Luna considered. 11 times this term, possibly 12. "And on none of those occasions had you observed an entrance at that location?" "No." McGonagall noted this. "Continue." Luna had stopped at the entrance and looked in. The interior of the corridor, she described it consistently as a corridor rather than a room, was dark beyond the first several feet, which were illuminated faintly by the reflected light of the main corridor's torches. The floor was stone. The walls appeared to be stone. The ceiling was not clearly visible. She had not smelled anything unusual. The air from the corridor was neither warmer nor colder than the main corridor. She had heard sounds. McGonagall set down her quill. "Describe the sounds." Luna was quiet for a moment. "They were voices," she said. "More than one. Possibly several. I could not distinguish individual words clearly. The quality of the sound was—" She paused. It was not like the sound of people in an adjacent room. It was more diffuse, as though the sound was coming from a larger space, or from multiple directions simultaneously. Could the sounds have originated from another part of the castle? A room nearby, for instance? "I considered that," Luna said. "I don't think so." The sound changed when I moved closer to the entrance. It became slightly more distinct. When I stepped back, it became less distinct. That suggests the source was inside the corridor, not elsewhere. McGonagall picked up her quill and noted this. "You said the voices were not individually distinguishable. Were they male or female, young or old?" "Both," Luna said. "I heard what seemed to be several different voices at different times. Some sounded like students. One or two sounded older." She paused. "There was laughter at one point, brief, and something that sounded like an argument, though conducted quietly. Were you frightened?" Luna appeared to consider this question seriously, as though it required the same precision as the others. "No," she said. "The sounds were not threatening in character." "Did you enter the corridor?" "No. I stood at the entrance for several minutes. Then I heard the Prefect approaching and stepped back into the main corridor." McGonagall reviewed her notes. "You said the sounds became more distinct as you moved closer. Did you form any conclusion about their nature?" This was the part Luna had spent Wednesday evening organizing, and she addressed it with the same measured delivery as the rest of her account. "I do not think they were ghosts," she said. "The Hogwarts ghosts have a distinct presence. They are visible, and when they speak, their voices have a particular quality, a resonance that is related to how they exist within the castle. What I heard was different. It was more like—" She paused again, and McGonagall waited. "It was more like a recording, something that had been captured rather than something that was actively occurring." McGonagall wrote this down. "A recording." "I don't know the correct classification," Luna said. "I am aware that is not a standard category. I am describing what it resembled most closely, not what I believe its technical designation to be." "That is a useful distinction," McGonagall said, and meant it in a purely functional sense. It was, in fact, a useful distinction for the purposes of the record. She completed her notes on that section, reviewed what she had written, and asked 3 clarifying questions. Whether the sounds had stopped at any point while Luna was present, whether Luna had any sense of the corridor's depth beyond what she could see, and whether she had heard any sounds that she recognized specifically rather than generally. To the first question, the sounds had continued without interruption for the duration of her time at the entrance. To the second, she had not been able to determine depth. The corridor extended beyond the visible range. To the third question, Luna was briefly quiet. "There was one moment," she said, "toward the end, when I thought I heard something more specific. A name, possibly. Or the beginning of one." She looked at McGonagall with the same steady attention as before. I may have been constructing pattern from indistinct sound. I cannot confirm it with certainty, so I did not wish to include it as a verified observation. But you are noting it? Yes, as an unverified impression. McGonagall wrote, student notes possible vocalization of specific name, unverified, self-qualified. That is appropriate, she said. Is there anything else you wish to add to your account? Luna thought for a moment. Only that the entrance was no longer there when I passed the same location the following morning. I checked. You checked? Yes. It seemed relevant to verify. McGonagall noted this. Student conducted informal follow-up observation. Following morning, no entrance present, and read back the full account in summary form. Luna confirmed it was accurate. McGonagall initialed the page, noted the date, and asked Luna to sign beside the notation account, given voluntarily and confirmed as accurate by student, which Luna did in her careful, unhurried hand. After Luna had left, McGonagall sat at her desk and reviewed the completed account against her preliminary notes from the archive. The structural notes from 1948 had recorded that 3 maintenance staff members had reported sounds described as voices, laughter, and indistinct conversation. Luna's account matched this in each specific detail. Voices, multiple, indistinct. Laughter, brief. Conversation, not clearly audible. The correspondence was precise enough to be significant. The 1948 entry had also noted that no source for the sounds had been identified. Luna's assessment that the sounds resembled a recording rather than an active presence was a more specific observation than anything in the structural notes, but it did not contradict them. It was, if accurate, a characterization of the same phenomenon from a closer position and with more careful attention. McGonagall added a section to her review notes. Student account, Thursday, October, 1996. Account given formally and recorded. Content consistent with historical observations in structural notes, volumes 14 and 16. Student characterization of sound source as recording rather than active presence or ghost. Noted as unclassified working description, not technical designation. Beneath this she wrote, recommend, consult headmaster, consult castle charms infrastructure classification. Determine whether existing structural anomaly category is adequate or whether reclassification is warranted. She closed her ledger and picked up her afternoon schedule. She had a 4th-year class shortly. The review would continue, but it would continue in the margins of everything else, as most administrative work did. The castle bell sounded the 1/4 hour. McGonagall gathered her notes and left her office. In the Ravenclaw common room that evening, Luna sat in the window seat with her notebook open. She wrote a single line under the heading she had established earlier in the week, which read, 5th floor east. Personal observations, not for formal record. The castle remembers. That is the most accurate description I have. Not the ghosts who remember themselves. The castle itself. I do not know the mechanism. I do not think the mechanism is the important part. She considered the line, decided it was accurate, and closed the notebook. Outside the window, the October sky was fully dark. The grounds were quiet. Somewhere below, the castle continued its evening routines, torches adjusting to their lower nighttime level, the kitchens completing the last of the clearing up. The prefects beginning their patrols. Luna put the notebook in her bag and went to bed. The request came through Luna on Friday morning. She found Harry in the corridor outside the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom, before the start of the first period, where he was standing with Ron and Hermione reviewing what appeared to be a set of revision notes. Luna approached without particular urgency and waited at the edge of the group until Harry noticed her. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" she said. "It won't take long." Ron and Hermione exchanged a brief look. Harry handed his revision notes to Hermione and stepped slightly aside. Luna told him about the corridor in the same sequence she had used for McGonagall's interview, though without the formal structure, shorter and without the precise notations that were relevant for official records, but not for this purpose. She told him what she had seen, what she had heard, and what she had concluded provisionally. She told him she thought a second account would be useful, both for her own understanding and because the review process McGonagall was conducting would likely be more complete with more than one student observation on record. Harry listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You're saying the corridor plays back sounds from, what, the past?" "I don't know the precise mechanism," Luna said. "I said it resembled a recording. That is the closest description I have." "And you want me to go in with you?" "I think it would be useful," Luna said. "You have—" She paused, selecting the phrasing with care. "You have context that I don't. For certain kinds of sounds. If the corridor produces what I think it produces, your account would add detail that mine cannot." Harry looked at her steadily for a moment. The bell for first period sounded from the floor below. "When?" he said. "We have a shared free period on Saturday afternoon," Luna said. "Second period. I checked. The timetables." Harry nodded. "All right." Luna nodded in return and went to Defense Against the Dark Arts. Saturday afternoon arrived grey and still. The castle was quieter on Saturday afternoons than on weekday afternoons. Fewer classes running, students distributed between the common rooms, the library, and the grounds. The fifth floor east corridor that afternoon was empty. They met at the top of the east staircase. Luna was carrying a small lantern, a functional one, fueled rather than enchanted, which she had signed out from the equipment store in the Ravenclaw common room that morning on the grounds that she was planning a visit to the grounds and preferred reliable light. Harry had his wand. He had not told Ron or Hermione where he was going, which Luna noted but did not comment on. They walked the corridor from the staircase, their footsteps the only sound. At the junction at E10, they stopped. The entrance was there. It presented exactly as Luna had described it, an opening in the east wall, standard door frame width. No door. The stone on either side was continuous and uninterrupted. The interior was dark beyond the first several feet, the light from the main corridor reaching only to the point where the floor curved very slightly downward, a detail Luna had not been able to confirm on her first visit, but noted now. Harry looked at it for a moment without speaking. "It wasn't here when I walked past this morning," he said. "No," Luna said. "It isn't consistently present. This is the second time I've seen it open." Harry looked at the entrance, then at the wall on either side of it, then back at the entrance. "Can you hear anything?" Luna listened. "Not from here. I needed to be closer on Tuesday." They approached together, stopping at the threshold. The corridor extended in front of them. Stone floor, stone walls, the ceiling lost in shadow above the reach of the lantern light. The floor's slight downward curve was more apparent from this position. The air was still. Harry heard it first. It was not loud. It was at the level of sound that required attention rather than simply registering. The kind of sound that was easy to miss if you were moving or not specifically listening. Voices, more than one, overlapping at intervals, then separating. The quality of the sound was diffuse, as Luna had described, spread across a space rather than originating from a single point. "I can hear them," he said. "Yes," Luna said. "Don't move yet. Let your ears adjust." He stood still. The sounds became marginally more distinct, in the way that a familiar piece of music becomes more distinct once you have identified the key. Not louder, but more organized to the ear. He could distinguish something closer to individual voices now, though not words. A lower register, something higher. A burst of laughter that cut off as though a door had closed somewhere in the distance. "It's coming from inside," he said. "Yes, further in, I think." The first time, I stood here for several minutes. The sounds didn't move. I don't believe the source moves. I think it is fixed, and the clarity changes with proximity. Harry looked into the corridor. The lantern in Luna's hand extended visibility perhaps 15 feet. Beyond that was darkness. "We go in," he said. They moved together, slowly. Luna held the lantern at shoulder height. Harry kept his wand in his hand, unlit. There was enough light from the lantern, and adding more light felt, for reasons he did not examine, wrong for this particular place. The floor continued its gradual downward slope for the first 20 feet, then leveled out. The walls were the same close-fitted grey stone as the main corridor. There were no doors, no alcoves, no branching passages. The corridor ran straight ahead into the dark. The sounds grew more distinct as they moved deeper. Harry could distinguish with more confidence now that there were several voices, not dozens, perhaps 4 or 5 at any given moment, shifting. Some seemed to occupy the foreground and others the background, as though the corridor were rendering different distances simultaneously. He heard laughter again. This time it did not cut off. It resolved into something recognizable, not the sound of a specific person he knew, but the sound of someone his age in a school corridor finding something genuinely amusing. An ordinary sound, the kind of sound that happened hundreds of times a day in a building full of students, and that he would not ordinarily have noticed at all. For some reason, here, it was very clear. They stopped at approximately 30 feet from the entrance. The corridor continued ahead of them, still straight, still dark beyond the lantern's reach. This is approximately where the 1948 records indicate the maintenance staff stopped, Luna said quietly, on the basis that they lacked suitable illumination for further progress. Harry nodded. He was listening. The Shah voices shifted. The lower register he had noticed from the entrance was more present now. Not a single voice, but several, adult register, occasionally cutting through the lighter sounds of what were clearly students. He heard fragments of what might have been a sentence, though the words did not assemble into anything he could follow. He heard something that might have been a name, spoken sharply, the way a teacher might use a student's name when requiring attention, and then, briefly, lasting no more than a few seconds before diffusing back into the general sound. He heard something that stopped him. He could not have said with certainty what it was. It was a voice, male, speaking in a tone that was neither raised nor particularly quiet. A conversational register, the register of someone talking to a room. He did not hear words. He heard the pattern of speech, the rhythm of it, the specific quality of how this particular voice moved between syllables, the slight pause at the end of a phrase before continuing. He knew that rhythm. He had heard recordings of it. He had heard descriptions of it from people who had known the owner of that voice in life. He stood still and let it continue for the few seconds that it lasted. Then it dissolved back into the surrounding sound, and he could not locate it again. Luna, beside him, said nothing. She had been watching him rather than listening, or listening and watching simultaneously. Harry exhaled slowly. "All right," he said. "Do you want to go further in?" He considered. "No," he said. "I don't think further in is the point." Luna nodded. This aligned, he suspected, with what she had already concluded, and she was confirming rather than deferring. They stood for several minutes more. Harry listened carefully, without the particular sharpening of attention that had accompanied the brief recognition, returning to the general character of what the corridor produced. Voices, laughter, conversation, the sound of a school rendered at a remove, present enough to be unmistakable, distant enough that the specific content was largely inaccessible. He thought of what Luna had said, a recording. He thought of what she had described to McGonagall, something captured rather than something actively occurring. He thought that both of those descriptions were accurate, and that neither of them was complete. The castle was not haunted in the conventional sense. The ghosts were a specific phenomenon, people who had chosen to remain or been unable to leave, and who persisted as themselves. What he was hearing was not that. What he was hearing was not any specific person persisting. It was the accumulated sound of the place. Everyone who had ever stood in a corridor like this one talked to someone, laughed at something, argued about something, called out a name, not any one of them in particular, all of them simultaneously, at a remove. He could not have said whether one specific voice had actually been in the corridor's accumulated record, or whether he had constructed the recognition from a sound that merely resembled something. He did not have enough to confirm it. What he had was an impression, the same category Luna had used in her formal account, and for the same reason, it was honest about its own uncertainty. He noted it in the way he had learned to note things that were not yet confirmed, and set it aside. They left the corridor after roughly a quarter of an hour. The entrance was still there behind them as they stepped back into the main corridor. They both looked at it for a moment. "I'll tell McGonagall," Luna said, "that you came, in case it's relevant to the review." "Fine," Harry said. He looked at the entrance once more. "Luna, what do you think it is? Not the description. What do you actually think?" Luna looked at the corridor entrance with the same steady attention she directed at most things. "I think the castle has been here for a very long time," she said. "And I think some buildings, after sufficient time, retain what has happened in them. Not as ghosts retain it, more the way stone holds warmth after the sun has gone." She paused. "I don't know if that is a magical process or simply a property of very old places. I suspect it may be both. Harry looked at the entrance. The sounds were not audible from outside, at the main corridor level. The opening was simply there, dark, quiet, a gap in the wall that should have been solid. "Right," he said. They walked back toward the staircase. Behind them, the corridor entrance remained open for a while longer, until the east wing was briefly occupied by a pair of third years taking a shortcut between floors, neither of whom noticed anything unusual, because by then the opening was gone, and the wall at E11 was unbroken stone, as the survey had always shown it. Luna's additional note to her personal observation record that evening was brief. "H accompanied me this afternoon. Duration roughly a quarter of an hour. He heard the voices. He did not say what specifically. I did not ask. The corridor seems to offer what is relevant to whoever is present. This may be important for classification." She underlined the last sentence. Then she closed the notebook and went to dinner. McGonagall submitted the request to the headmaster's portrait gallery on Sunday morning. The process for consulting the portrait gallery on administrative matters was established and straightforward. A written query was placed in the wooden tray on the small table outside the headmaster's office door, a tray that had been there since at least the 1920s, based on its appearance in a staff photograph from that period that hung in the second-floor corridor. The query was collected by whichever portrait was currently serving as the gallery's designated receiver, a rotating responsibility among the more communicative portraits, and distributed to whichever former headmaster or headmistress was best positioned to address it. McGonagall's query was 2 paragraphs. The first described the structural anomaly in factual terms: location, documented history from the archive, frequency of appearances, characteristics as reported by observing staff and students across multiple decades. The second paragraph asked a specific question: whether any former headmaster or headmistress had direct knowledge of the corridor's origin or nature that was not reflected in the existing written record. She placed the query in the tray before breakfast. The response came that morning, delivered by a small folded note that appeared on her desk while she was reviewing third-year transfiguration papers. The note was written in a hand she recognized as that of former headmistress Eustacia Vane, who served as the gallery's current designated receiver and whose portrait, a severe woman in a dark green robe, hung in the lower left corner of the headmaster's office arrangement. The note read, "Query. Received and distributed. Headmaster Dippet has indicated familiarity with the matter and requests a consultation at your convenience. Headmaster Fortiscu has also indicated partial knowledge and will contribute if required. Neither has written record to add beyond what the archive holds. Recommend in-person consultation." E.V. McGonagall noted the names. Armando Dippet had been headmaster from 1925 to 1956. His tenure overlapped precisely with the period of the 1948 Structural Notes entry, which was the most detailed record in the archive. Dexter Fortiscu had preceded him, serving from 1895 to 1925, which placed him in the period just before first documented observation in 1933. Whatever Fortiscu knew would be from the undocumented period. She went to the headmaster's office that morning. Dumbledore was not present. He had left early for a meeting that McGonagall had been informed of in general terms and not in specifics, which was standard for his current schedule. His absence from the office meant the portraits had the space to themselves, which often produced more candid consultation. The portraits were, in McGonagall's experience, slightly more expansive in their accounts when the current headmaster was not present to hear them. She closed the office door, stood before the portrait arrangement, and addressed Dippet directly. Armando Dippet's portrait showed him as he had appeared in the later years of his tenure. A slight man with a high forehead and careful eyes, seated in a chair that did not quite match the chair in the portrait beside him. He had been awake and attentive when McGonagall entered, which suggested he had been expecting her. "The fifth floor corridor," McGonagall said. "I have reviewed the archive. I have the structural notes from your tenure. I would like whatever you can add." Dippet folded his painted hands. "I was aware of it for the full 30 years of my headmastership," he said. His voice had the slightly compressed quality common to portrait speech, present and clear, but without the full resonance of a living voice. It appeared on 9 occasions during that period, by my count. Each appearance lasted between several hours and 1 full day. The longest was in the spring of 1944. McGonagall noted this. The structural notes from 1948 record 7 observations up to that point. The notes were kept by the maintenance staff, Dippet said. They recorded what they observed directly. I was aware of 2 additional appearances that were not reported to maintenance. One observed by a member of the teaching staff who mentioned it to me informally and did not consider it worth a formal report, and one which I observed myself during a late inspection of the upper floors. McGonagall wrote, Dippet, 9 total appearances confirmed during tenure, 2 unrecorded in maintenance notes. What did you observe on that occasion? The entrance was open when I reached the East Junction, Dippet said. I stood at the threshold for a short time. I heard what the maintenance staff had described, voices at a remove, indistinct. He paused. I went in. McGonagall looked up from her notes. Not far, Dippet said. 20 or 30 feet. Approximately where your current students stopped, I would imagine, given the lantern range. The sounds became somewhat more distinct at that distance, but remained largely inaccessible in terms of specific content. He was quiet for a moment. I stood there for perhaps 5 minutes. I did not find it distressing. I found it clarifying in a specific sense. That is not a technical observation. It is simply what I noticed. Clarifying in what sense? Dippet considered. I was headmaster during difficult years, he said. The corridor, when I stood in it, produced the sound of a school functioning. Students, staff, ordinary institutional activity. It was a useful reminder, at that particular moment, that the school had been functioning for a very long time and would continue to do so. He paused again. I am aware that is not relevant to your classification question. I mention it only because you asked what I observed. McGonagall noted it. Did you investigate the origin? I consulted Fortiscu, Dippet said, as you are doing now. McGonagall turned her attention to the portrait of Dexter Fortiscu, which hung 2 positions to the right of Dippet's. A larger portrait, the subject shown standing rather than seated, a broad-shouldered man with a greying beard and reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead. Fortiscu had been listening throughout and did not appear to require prompting. I inherited the knowledge of the corridor from my predecessor, Fortiscu said, as Dippet inherited it from me, and as you are receiving it now. There is a tradition of passing this particular matter between headmasters verbally, rather than through written record. Deliberately so, as it happens. McGonagall set her quill down, deliberately. The decision was made. I cannot tell you precisely when, because it predates my own tenure, and I received only the conclusion rather than the reasoning, that the corridor should not be formally classified in the administrative record. Fortescue's expression was neutral. The concern was that formal classification would generate formal procedure. Formal procedure would generate access restrictions. Access restrictions would generate curiosity, and curiosity in a school of this size reliably generates exactly the kind of concentrated student interest that the corridor does not require. McGonagall considered this. It was, she acknowledged, a recognizable institutional logic. She had applied similar reasoning herself on other matters, but it has been left as an unresolved structural anomaly in the maintenance records, which is a category that generates very little interest, Fortiscu said. Students do not read maintenance records. Staff treat unresolved structural anomalies as someone else's administrative responsibility until they become urgent. The classification, or lack of it, served as a functional management strategy rather than an oversight. Until now, McGonagall said. Until now, Fortiscu agreed. Though I would note that the corridor has appeared and closed again without incident, as it has always done. The current situation differs only in that someone is conducting a formal review. Someone is conducting a formal review, McGonagall said, because a student was found at the entrance during a night patrol. A prefect filed a report, and the process followed its standard course, which is how the process is supposed to work. Fortiscu inclined his head. Quite so. McGonagall returned to her notes. The origin, she said. You said you received the conclusion rather than the reasoning. What was the conclusion? Fortiscu moved to a more comfortable position within his portrait frame. A small adjustment, the habit of someone preparing to give a longer answer. The corridor is not a construction, he said. It was not built. It was not enchanted in the conventional sense, by which I mean no individual caster or group of casters produced it as a deliberate act of magic. The understanding that was passed to me was that it is a property of the castle itself, emergent rather than designed. Emergent, McGonagall said. The castle is very old, Fortiscu said. Older than reliable documentation, as you know. It has been continuously inhabited and continuously magical for longer than any other structure in Britain. The understanding, and I emphasize that this is institutional knowledge rather than verified research, passed verbally and therefore subject to the losses that verbal transmission involves, is that the castle, over sufficient time, developed certain properties that were not installed by any maker. The corridor is one of them. McGonagall wrote carefully. The structural notes from 1948 characterize it as a residual memory feature. The student who observed it this week described it as something that had been captured rather than something actively occurring. Are those characterizations consistent with what you were told? Fortescue looked at her with something that might, on a living face, have been mild approval. Yes, he said. The formulation I received was simpler. The castle remembers. The corridor is where some of that remembering becomes audible. He paused. I was told not to think of it as a room or a passage in the architectural sense, but as a condition, a state the castle enters periodically when something in its current situation, the emotional condition of its inhabitants specifically, creates the right circumstances. McGonagall was very still for a moment. When the inhabitants are under stress, under significant collective stress, yes, the corridor does not appear during ordinary terms. It appeared during difficult years with greater frequency. It appeared, according to what Dippet told me, with some regularity during a particularly difficult period in the early 1940s. Fortiscu looked at her steadily. The current academic year is not by any account an ordinary one. McGonagall did not respond to this directly. She made a note. Appearance frequency correlates with periods of institutional stress, confirmed across multiple tenures. Beneath it, she wrote, current year, consistent with historical pattern. She looked up. You said the decision not to classify it formally was made before your tenure. How far before? I was told it had been the practice since the corridor was first observed, Fortiscu said, which, from what I was told, was considerably earlier than your archive records. The 1933 entry in the maintenance notes represents the first time it was recorded in writing. It had been known to headmasters before that. How much before? Fortiscu was quiet for a moment. The formulation I was given was that it had always been there. I took that to mean within living institutional memory, which at the time of my tenure extended back perhaps another 100 years through portrait consultation. I did not investigate further. He paused. I was told the founders were aware of it. I cannot verify that. McGonagall wrote, possible origin, pre-documentation. Portrait tradition suggests founders' era awareness. Unverified. She underlined unverified. She asked 3 further questions. Whether any former headmaster had attempted to close or remove the corridor. Fortiscu said no, and that it had been the consistent view that attempting to do so would be inadvisable, though the specific reasoning had been lost from the verbal record. Whether the corridor had ever produced any harm to any student or staff member who had entered it, both Dippet and Fortiscu confirmed no recorded harm. Whether there was any action the current administration was expected to take beyond monitoring, Fortiscu said the historical practice was documentation and observation, and that no former headmaster had seen fit to alter that practice. McGonagall closed her ledger. Thank you, she said, which was the standard close for a portrait consultation. Dippet spoke once more before she turned to leave. The student who went in this week, he said. Was she all right? She was not harmed, McGonagall said. No, Dippet said. That was not quite what I asked. McGonagall considered the distinction. She was composed, she said. Her account was orderly and precise. She appeared to find the experience interesting rather than distressing. Dippet nodded within his portrait frame. Some students do, he said. The corridor tends to offer what the person is capable of receiving. In my experience, those who are frightened by it generally do not enter far. Those who are not frightened tend to find it. He used the same word he had used before, clarifying. McGonagall noted this because it was relevant to the record and left the office. In her own office, she added a final section to her review notes. She headed it, Portrait Consultation, Sunday, October. 1996, and wrote out the substance of both accounts in full. At the bottom of the section, she wrote a single line that functioned as her preliminary conclusion, pending Dumbledore's input. The corridor is a documented, recurring, non-harmful feature of the castle of indeterminate origin, associated with periods of collective stress, and historically managed through observation and non-intervention. Current appearance consistent with historical pattern. Formal reclassification recommended. No remediation indicated. She set down her quill and looked at what she had written. Then she picked up her afternoon schedule and continued with her day. Dumbledore returned to Hogwarts on Monday morning. McGonagall was aware of his return because his name reappeared in the staff schedule, notation on the board, outside the deputy headmistress's office, a small brass plate updated daily by the administrative charm that managed staff availability records. The plate had read Headmaster, off-site since Saturday. By the time the castle was properly awake on Monday, it read Headmaster, in residence, which meant he had arrived before breakfast and was likely already at his desk. She sent a note requesting a brief meeting at his earliest convenience. The response came within the hour. This afternoon. A D. In the intervening hours, McGonagall completed the documentation that the meeting would require. She had spent Sunday evening drafting the formal reclassification proposal, a standard administrative document used when a recorded item in the castle's maintenance and structural registry needed its status updated. The form had 4 sections: current classification, proposed classification, supporting evidence, and recommended action. She had filled each section with the precision the archive review and portrait consultation warranted. Current classification, structural anomaly, unresolved, origin unknown. First recorded 1933. Ref. Maintenance notes, volumes 14, 16, 19. Proposed classification, recurring institutional feature, non-harmful, emergent property of castle structure, appearance correlated with periods of collective occupant stress, historical management, observation and documentation, no remediation indicated. Supporting evidence occupied 2 full pages of attached notes, referencing the archive sources, the portrait consultation, and the 2 student accounts by initials rather than full names, as was standard for student-referenced administrative documents. Recommended action: update structural registry, establish monitoring protocol, restrict corridor access during periods of appearance via standard restricted area procedure. No further investigation required at this time. She reviewed the draft twice, made 2 minor corrections to the wording of the proposed classification, and had it ready on her desk well before the afternoon. The meeting with Dumbledore lasted the better part of half an hour. He read the documentation in full without speaking, which McGonagall had expected. He read everything he was given before commenting, a practice she respected for its efficiency. When he finished, he set the papers down on his desk with the careful alignment of someone who intended to return to them. The portrait consultation was thorough, he said. Fortiscu was particularly useful, McGonagall said. He confirmed the verbal transmission tradition and provided context that the written record does not contain. Did he mention the founders? He noted it as unverified information received through the verbal tradition. McGonagall said, I recorded it with that qualification. Dumbledore looked at the reclassification proposal for a moment. The proposed classification is sound, he said. Emergent property is the correct category. The charms infrastructure team will recognize it. There are 2 other features of the castle in the same category, though neither manifests in the same way as this one. McGonagall noted this. Are they documented in the archive? One is. The other is in the same tradition as this corridor, known to headmasters, managed through observation, not formally classified. He paused. After this review, I think the argument for consistent formal classification is persuasive. I will add the second feature to the documentation process. The access restriction, McGonagall said, moving to the recommended action section. I have proposed standard restricted area procedure. A notation on the patrol maps flagging the location, a requirement that any student found at the entrance during an appearance is redirected, and a prohibition on unsupervised entry. That is appropriate, Dumbledore said. He was quiet for a moment. The 2 students who entered this week, Luna Lovegood and Harry Potter, McGonagall said. The names were not in the formal documentation, but there was no reason to use initials in a direct conversation. Miss Lovegood's account is in the file, Dumbledore said. Mr. Potter accompanied her on Saturday. She informed me of this. I have noted it in the review file under additional observations. Neither student was harmed. Both accounts are consistent with historical reports. Dumbledore looked at the window for a moment. The afternoon light was flat and grey, cloud cover having moved in from the north during the late morning. Mr. Potter's account, he said. Did he provide a formal one? He has not yet been formally interviewed, McGonagall said. I received Luna Lovegood's account first, as she was the student identified in the Prefect report. I intended to request Potter's account as a secondary record. I have not yet scheduled it. I would suggest, Dumbledore said, with the careful evenness he used when making suggestions that were in practice, recommendations, that Mr. Potter's account be recorded informally rather than formally, if he is willing to provide one, placed in the review file as an additional observation rather than a primary witness record. The distinction will be meaningful to him, I think, given the nature of what he may have heard. McGonagall looked at him. You know what he heard. I can make a reasonable assessment, Dumbledore said. The corridor provides what is present in the castle's accumulated record and offers it in relation to whoever is listening. For Mr. Potter, in his current circumstances, the voices of people he has lost would not be an unexpected feature of that experience. McGonagall was quiet for a moment. Then she wrote a brief note in her ledger. Potter account, informal record, additional observation category, pending. I will speak with him, she said. There is no urgency, Dumbledore said. The classification process does not depend on his account. It is a matter of completeness. He signed the reclassification proposal at the bottom of the form, added the date, and returned it to McGonagall. Submitted to the Charms Infrastructure team through the standard channel, he said. Copy the caretaking office. The patrol map amendment can be processed once the reclassification is confirmed. I would estimate several days for the infrastructure team to review and countersign. I'll submit it this afternoon, McGonagall said. She gathered the documentation, confirmed the follow-up actions, and stood to leave. At the door, she paused. Fortiscu said the corridor tends to offer what a person is capable of receiving she said. He said those who are not frightened by it tend to find it clarifying. Dumbledore looked at her with the expression she had come to associate over many years with his particular mode of careful attention. Did he said. I noted it in the consultation record, McGonagall said. I thought it was relevant. It is, Dumbledore said. He looked briefly at the window again. Hogwarts has been a great many things to a great many people over a very long time. It is not surprising that some of that accumulates. He paused. Submit the reclassification. Establish the protocol. The corridor will take care of the rest. McGonagall left the office. The submission to the Charms infrastructure team went through the standard administrative channel that afternoon. A sealed document placed in the interdepartmental post tray outside the Deputy Headmistress's office, addressed to the Senior Charms Infrastructure Officer, which was currently Professor Flitwick in his secondary administrative capacity alongside his teaching role. Flitwick received it before the end of the school day, read it in his office before dinner, and sent a brief acknowledgement note. Received and under review. Will countersign within 3 days pending standard verification check. No concerns anticipated. F. His response was what McGonagall had expected. Flitwick was efficient with infrastructure paperwork. The restricted area protocol was drafted that evening by McGonagall and the head boy, who managed the formal patrol documentation. The protocol was brief and operational. The 5th floor east corridor, grid reference E11, was to be added to the patrol map with a notation reading variable access feature, restricted during periods of appearance. Prefects observing an open entrance at that location were to note it in the patrol log, redirect any students present, and not enter the corridor themselves. The notation would appear on the updated patrol maps once the reclassification was confirmed. In the interim, the existing arrangement, the observation entry at the start and end of each 5th floor patrol, was extended to cover any day of the week rather than Tuesday alone. The head boy updated the patrol assignments accordingly, distributed the amended instructions to the relevant prefects, and filed the update in the patrol log with the standard administrative initials. The process had been running for 11 days since Luna Lovegood's initial discovery. McGonagall noted this in her review file as within the normal range for a structural anomaly reclassification. The 2 previous reclassifications she had overseen had taken 9 days and 14 days, respectively. Later in the week, Professor Flitwick stopped McGonagall in the corridor outside the staff room between afternoon classes. The reclassification, he said. He was carrying a stack of marked essays and a teacup, the latter balanced with the practiced ease of someone who had navigated staff room corridors with full hands for several decades. I've completed the verification check. Any complications? None. He fell into step beside her, adjusting his pace to match hers. The corridor matches 2 previously documented emergent features in the castle's charms substrate. Different in manifestation, same in origin. Category. The classification you've proposed is correct. Good. I've added a technical note to the counter-signature, Flitwick said, purely for the infrastructure record. The corridor's appearances correlate with elevated ambient magical resonance in the surrounding structure, which is the technical way of saying what your document describes as collective occupant stress. The two conditions are measurable in the same way. I thought it was worth having the technical notation for completeness. McGonagall noted this. Will it be useful for monitoring? Potentially. If we wanted to predict appearances rather than simply observe them, the ambient resonance levels would give several hours advance notice. I've noted the measurement approach in the technical addendum. He paused. I'm not recommending active monitoring. That would require resources that aren't currently available, and the historical management approach seems to have been adequate. But the capability exists if it's ever needed. I'll note it in the review file, McGonagall said. Flitwick countersigned the reclassification document that afternoon, added his technical note, and returned the completed paperwork to McGonagall's office before the evening meal. The structural registry update could now be processed. Filch received his copy of the reclassification notification with the Morning Post later that week. He read it at his desk as he had read the original query nearly a fortnight before, standing with Mrs. Norris observing the middle distance from the desk corner. The notification informed him that the 5th floor east corridor, grid reference E11, had been reclassified from structural anomaly, unresolved, to recurring institutional feature, non-harmful, and that the maintenance record for the site should be updated accordingly. The pending status on his original site inspection entry could be closed. Future appearances of the corridor entrance should be noted in the maintenance log as institutional feature, active and reported to the deputy headmistress as a courtesy notification rather than a maintenance concern. Filch found his original entry in the maintenance ledger, drew a single line through the pending notation, and wrote beside it, Resolved, reclassified, per deputy headmistress, October 1996. He initialed it and closed the ledger. Then he opened a fresh page, wrote 5th floor east, 11, recurring institutional feature, and noted the classification reference number from the reclassification document. He left the rest of the page blank for future entries. He filed the notification in the folder labeled Resolved, Structural, which occupied the 3rd shelf of his filing cabinet, between a folder from 1989 regarding a staircase reconfiguration on the 3rd floor, and a folder from 1994 regarding the broom cupboard variants that had remained technically open since 1987 and had finally been formally closed during a routine archive review 2 years prior. The drawer closed cleanly. The updated patrol maps were distributed to the prefects at the start of the following week, folded into the weekly patrol assignment sheet. The notation at E11 read, as drafted, Variable access feature, restricted during periods of appearance. Observe and report. No entry. Anthony Goldstein read his updated map at breakfast, noted the E11 entry, and made a brief notation in his personal schedule to review the formal guidance document that had been referenced in the covering memo. He would read it during his free period that afternoon. Hannah Abbott, reviewing the maps before distribution, had already read the guidance document twice. She had added a clean copy of it to the prefect reference folder that lived on the 3rd shelf of the prefect's bathroom anteroom, beside the patrol log. The patrol log for the week was up to date. The incident that had begun it, Luna Lovegood at the corridor entrance, Anthony Goldstein's careful notation, the diagram clipped to the page, was now a fortnight in the past, and several entries back in the current volume. Subsequent entries had accumulated in the ordinary way. Doors tested, students redirected, torch brackets noted, the small routine findings of a school being monitored and maintained. The log continued, as it always did, toward the end of the current volume and the beginning of the next. The structural registry update was processed toward the end of the week. It was handled by the castle's administrative charm network, the same system that managed staff availability notations, classroom assignment records, and the quarterly maintenance schedule. The update required no manual input beyond the countersigned reclassification document, which McGonagall fed into the network's intake parchment that afternoon. The charm processed it before the evening meal, updating the relevant entry in the structural registry from its previous classification to the new one, generating a confirmation receipt and cross-referencing the update against the existing patrol map notation to confirm consistency. McGonagall filed the confirmation receipt in the review folder, which now contained, in sequence, the original Prefect report, Filch's site inspection notation, her preliminary archive notes, Luna Lovegood's formal account, the portrait consultation record, the reclassification proposal and countersignature, Flitwick's technical addendum, and the confirmation receipt. The folder was complete. She wrote on the cover tab, in her standard administrative hand, 5th floor East Corridor, E11, Structural Review, October 1996. Status: resolved. She placed it in the filing cabinet under Structural, resolved and classified, between a folder from 1989 regarding a staircase reconfiguration on the 3rd floor and a folder from 1994 regarding the broom cupboard variants that had remained technically open since 1987 and had finally been formally closed during a routine archive review 2 years prior. The drawer closed cleanly. McGonagall had spoken with Harry Potter earlier that week, informally, as Dumbledore had suggested. She had not scheduled it formally. She had encountered him in the corridor outside her classroom after the last period of the day, when the other students from his Transfiguration class had already dispersed, and he was repacking his bag with the slightly distracted efficiency of someone whose mind was partly elsewhere. She had asked him to stay a moment. She told him that she was completing the review of the corridor, and that his account, if he was willing to provide it, would be recorded as an additional observation rather than a formal witness statement. She told him there was no requirement and no consequence attached to either choice. Harry had looked at her for a moment. Then he had sat down on the bench beside the classroom door and given his account. It was shorter than Luna's. He was not by nature an organized narrator of his own experiences, and he gave the factual sequence without the careful precision Luna had applied to hers. But the substance was consistent. The entrance, the darkness, the sounds, the quality of the voices at 30 feet, the duration. He described what he had heard in the general terms he had available and confirmed that he had heard, briefly, something he recognized in character, if not in specific words. He did not name who he thought he had heard. McGonagall did not ask. She wrote his account in the review file under Additional Observations, Informal Record, and noted at the bottom, account consistent with primary student record and historical observations. No contradictions. Student reported no distress. When she had finished writing, Harry had asked, without particular weight behind the question, whether the corridor would come back. "Yes," she said. "Periodically. It has been doing so for a considerable time." He had nodded at this in the way he nodded at information that confirmed something he had already largely concluded. "And people can go in." "Access will be restricted going forward," McGonagall said. "The patrol protocol has been updated. Students found at the entrance will be redirected." Harry looked at the floor for a moment. Then he picked up his bag and stood. "Right," he said. "Potter." He paused. "The corridor has been part of this castle for longer than any current record can confirm. What it holds has been accumulating for a very long time. It is not going anywhere." He looked at her. She held his gaze in the way she held the gaze of students who required steadiness rather than comfort. "I know," he said. He left. McGonagall returned to her office. The Prefect patrol that Friday evening completed its first full circuit under the updated protocol. The Prefect assigned to the 5th floor east that evening was a 6th-year Hufflepuff named Megan Jones, who had received the updated patrol map at the start of the week and read the guidance document during a free period, as the covering memo had recommended. She was thorough and conscientious, which was why she had been assigned a solo patrol route rather than a paired one. When she reached the junction at E10 that evening, she stopped to conduct the observation entry the protocol required. She looked at the wall from E10 to E11. She noted the condition of the wall, intact, no entrance present, and the torch bracket near E8, which was still flickering in the way that suggested the enchantment was wearing. She wrote this in the patrol log as a separate maintenance notation, because it had appeared in the log twice before without resolution, and she was of the view that a third entry might prompt action. She did not linger. There was nothing to linger for. The wall was a wall. She continued her patrol. Luna Lovegood walked past the 5th floor East Junction the following morning, on her way to breakfast, as she often did. It was not a direct route from Ravenclaw Tower to the Great Hall. It added several minutes to the walk, but she preferred it to the more direct route along the 6th floor, which was noisier in the mornings. The wall at E11 was solid. The corridor was not present. She did not stop. She noted it in the way she noted most things, as information filed and retained, and continued toward the stairs. She had received a brief administrative note the previous afternoon informing her that the review she had contributed to was complete and that the relevant feature had been reclassified and incorporated into the castle's formal structural documentation. The note thanked her for her account and confirmed that her formal record had been filed and closed. It was signed by McGonagall and stamped with the administrative seal. Luna had read it, noted that the process had concluded in the way processes were supposed to conclude, and placed it in her desk drawer with her other correspondence. The corridor was now in the records. What it was had a name, or the closest available name. The sounds it produced had been described, compared, and entered into the institutional memory of the school in a form that would persist on a shelf in the administrative archive, rather than simply in the verbal tradition passed between headmasters. She was not certain this changed anything about what the corridor was. She thought it probably did not. The castle would continue to remember regardless of how the records described it. But the records were more accurate than they had been. That was worth something. The following Monday, the Prefect log for the previous week was reviewed, initialed, and shelved in the monthly storage section of the anteroom. The new week's log was placed on the desk, its first page dated and headed in the head boy's handwriting. The patrol assignments for the week were distributed. The 5th floor East Patrol route now included the E11 observation entry as a standard item, not flagged, not marked for special attention, simply listed between the torch bracket check near E8 and the junction confirmation at E10 as one more point of routine monitoring in a building that had always required routine monitoring. Filch completed his first scheduled walk of the 5th floor under the new protocol that same afternoon. He checked the torch bracket at E8, which was still flickering. He wrote it in his maintenance log as recurring, escalate, which was the notation used when a minor issue had been recorded 3 or more times without resolution and required a formal work order rather than a routine request. He would submit the work order before the end of the day. At E11, the wall was solid. He pressed his palm against it once, briefly, in the way he always did, not expecting anything, only checking. The stone was cool and consistent under his hand. He noted it in his ledger as E11, no appearance, and continued along the corridor. Before the end of term, the corridor appeared once more. It came on a Tuesday evening in the 2nd week of November, open for less than 3 hours before closing again. The prefect on duty noted it in the patrol log, redirected one second-year Gryffindor who had stopped to look at it with uncomplicated curiosity, and filed the report in the standard format. McGonagall received the courtesy notification the following morning, noted it in the monitoring record as appearance 2, current academic year, and forwarded it to Flitwick for the ambient resonance log he had established as part of his technical addendum. The second-year Gryffindor, redirected to his dormitory without incident, had stood near the entrance for only a moment before the prefect arrived. He had not heard anything, or if he had, he did not mention it. He was more interested in whether being found near a restricted area would result in house points being deducted. It did not, as he had not entered, and was satisfied with this outcome. The patrol log entry for that evening was signed and filed. The week continued. Hogwarts moved through November, as it always did, by schedule, by bell, by the accumulated weight of its own long routine. The staircases moved on their rotations. The kitchens produced meals at their appointed hours. Students arrived at classrooms and left them. The torch bracket near E8 was finally repaired on a Wednesday afternoon by a maintenance charm submitted through the formal work order process, burning steadily from that evening onward without further notation. The prefect log moved through its current volume toward the end of the term. The review folder sat in its cabinet drawer, properly classified, properly closed. The structural registry held its updated entry. The patrol maps reflected the new notation at E11, unremarkable among the dozens of other notations that guided the prefects through their nightly circuits of the castle. Somewhere on the 5th floor, behind a wall that was sometimes a wall and sometimes was not, the sounds continued in whatever way they continued, unscheduled, unobserved, belonging to no particular week or term or year. The log moved on to the next entry. Hogwarts continued.